Hi, Gary Zacharias with the Apologist Bookshelf. I've got a new book and a new author to introduce to you. His name is Charlie Campbell, and I know him personally. He lives not too far from me. He speaks at conferences and churches and schools all over North America on evidences for God and reliability of the Bible. And if you can't have him come to your church or small group or whatever, oh man, just take a look sometime at his website. It's called alwaysbeready.com. That's all one word, alwaysbeready.com. He's the author of all sorts of articles and books and videos that you can look at online, answer a lot of your questions. You might want to pick up one of his DVDs and use it in a small group. Just to give you an example, Dr. Ed Hinson, he's a professor of religion at Liberty University. He said, Charlie Campbell's books and materials are incredible, thoroughly researched, and very well written. He's an apologist extraordinaire. Don't miss his stuff. It'll stretch your mind, stir your soul, and bless your heart. So this, the book I've got in front of me now is so nice. It's short. Let's see, about 100 pages. And, that's cool. He has an online apologetics course. I didn't even notice that. It's toward the back of the book here. And it's called alwaysbeready.teachable.com. It says, no homework or test, just fun times of learning. So Charlie is a great guy. The book that I'm going to mention to you today, like I said, it's short. It's called 1 Minute Answers to Skeptics. 1 hyphen is the title. 1 hyphen minute answers to skeptics. His name again, Charlie, Charlie, Charlie Campbell. Concise responses to the top 50 questions and objections that people have to Christianity. He said there are probably some other good questions, but these are the ones that he hears a lot when he goes all across the country speaking. Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel fame says outstanding. Norm Geisler, pretty well-known apologist, said there's a handy book with helpful answers for busy people. Chuck Colson, I hope many seekers will give serious consideration to the thoughts so well expressed in this timely and pithy book. Well worth reading. So this is now the 3rd edition. And it does questions about God, questions about the Bible, questions about atheism. What about some of the moral issues like slavery in the Bible and genocide? And what about the history of the Christian church and hell and evil and suffering? And Jesus, did he exist? And what about this whole idea of the virgin birth? Didn't they get that from other religions? And no evidence that Jesus rose from the grave. I mean, it goes on and on. These are some really interesting questions. So this is a book that's easy to read and easy to pass around to other people. 1 Minute Answers to Skeptics. So what I plan on doing is just kind of start in the first section, and we'll see how far we get. So here's number 1. He says he gets this a lot. There's absolutely no evidence that God exists. So Campbell, in a sense, play acts here as if he is talking to this person instead of saying, here are the reasons. He starts off saying, well, that's interesting that you've concluded that. Could I ask you a question? What are the evidences that you've rejected? What books did you read where the author lays out evidence for God? I'm sure you've read some of them to conclude that there's no evidence that God exists. Now that's, you ask those questions humbly and lovingly, of course, but isn't it interesting? It's always the Christian that feels he or she has to give an answer. Oh, there's no evidence for God. Oh, yes, there is. Here it comes. But why don't we turn the tables? That's what Charlie is doing here. We ask the person for their support. After all, they made the claim. And it's a pretty good idea. If somebody challenges you, they have made a claim. It's their responsibility to come up with proof, not you. The evidence should be with them. So why would they say there's no evidence that God exists? So then Charlie says, well, what about just looking at the human body? What's going on? And says, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? You got all these bones and the muscles, and the heart beats 100,000 times a day. It pumps about 75 gallons of blood an hour through more than 60,000 miles of veins, arteries, and capillaries. The eyes, he said, are composed of more than 2 million working parts. Wow. Said, what's going on? What is allowing your body to function so well and tell it what to do? And he says it's DNA inside the cells. So you have 37 trillion cells, an average person does. What a huge amount of information. It is information. DNA is information. So where did it come from? He says Bill Gates says DNA is somewhat like a computer program, but way more advanced than anything that Microsoft ever created. He actually quotes Francis Crick. Now, Crick is an atheist. He's one of the two that discovered DNA. So he says he estimates the odds that intelligent life exists on the earth as a result of non-directed chance, in other words, just accidentally popping into existence. He says, Crick talking, thinks it's about 1 chance in 10 to the 2 billionth power. Wow. He said, with such overwhelming odds, why would you bet that there is no God? He said that incredible complexity inside all of us, it seems like that comes from an intelligent designer. So he's using the argument from design, the teleological argument. I think that's good. And by the way, every time he ends one of his questions that he answers, he has a quotation. So here's John Lennox. There's another guy I like a lot. Always reminds me of Santa Claus without the beard. Lennox is a real jovial, incredibly interesting guy. Here's what John Lennox said. We have only to see a few letters of the alphabet spelling our name in the sand to recognize at once the work of an intelligent agent. How much more likely, then, is the existence of an intelligent creator behind human DNA, the colossal biological database that contains no fewer than 3.5 billion letters. He says that's the longest word yet discovered. Isn't that good? Yeah, so there's the first one. Why do we think God exists? Well, there are several lines of argument. So he's doing the one from design. Now you could argue as far as the universe coming into existence, how is that possible? You could argue the moral argument, the argument from beauty. I mean, a lot of ways to argue for God's existence, but I like what he's doing. He's starting with the organization that we all see inside all of us. Here's number 2. Here's another challenge. The Bible was written by men. It's not trustworthy. Well, we've heard that before, haven't we? So again, I like the way Charlie starts off. Ask questions. Have you read the Bible? Have you read any books or articles that give good reasons to reject the Bible? Were those books written by men? Well, if you said it was written by men, the Bible's written by men, so it's not trustworthy. He said, but then that means what you read, rejecting the Bible, is not trustworthy. He said, just because something was written by men doesn't mean it's not trustworthy. He said, humans are capable of communicating the truth. Yeah, exactly. He said, what if those who desire to communicate truthfully even had God's help when they wrote? He said things would turn out pretty well, wouldn't they? And he says there's good reasons to trust what the authors of the Bible wrote. He says compare the Bible to other ancient religious writings. It has all sorts of evidence, fulfilled prophecies, archaeological discoveries, internal harmony, historical confirmation with the records of all the other people that lived during those times, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Romans, numerous scientific discoveries that help validate different details and so on. And I like the way he ends the challenge there. If I gave you a book that lays out 10 different lines of evidence for the Bible, would you be willing to read it? Now, where's he getting the idea of a book that lays out 10 different lines of evidence? Well, he said he likes to give away copies of his books called Scrolls and Stones, Compelling Evidence the Bible Can Be Trusted. Okay, so he's got a book, Scrolls and Stones, so you might check that one out. How about this one? Here's a third contention, a third complaint. Well, God doesn't exist. If he did, he'd appear in some kind of public setting and prove it to the world. And then Charlie starts off, you mean like the time God came to the earth in the person of Jesus and raised the dead and healed cripples and opened the eyes of the blind and then be dragged away and nailed to a cross? He said God did appear publicly. God knows probably appearing to you publicly won't change your heart. He's already provided enough evidence for his existence if people really want to know him. We see that in Psalm 19, Romans 1, and Acts 14. So Charlie challenges the person, you could reject him, but just be assured of this, on the day of judgment, when you stand before God and your sins are exposed, if you say, well, the evidence for God wasn't clear enough, that's not going to work. It really is clear enough. And he ends that chapter with, I say chapter, just a short paragraph there. He ends with 2 quotes I like a lot. One is by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek, 2 really good apologists. God has provided enough evidence in this life to convince anyone willing to believe, yet he's also left some ambiguity so as not to compel the unwilling. In this way, God gives us the opportunity to either love him or to reject him without violating our freedom. Isn't that a good point? Sure, God could step out of his realm and write in large letters across the sky, I exist, and he could come down in a cloud and make all of us bow and worship him, but we have no free will at that point. So he trusts free will so much, he thinks it's so important, he allows us to take what we see and make a decision based on that. He also has a quote here from J.P. Moreland, another wonderful apologist. God maintains a delicate balance between keeping his existence sufficiently evident so people will know he's there, and yet hiding his presence enough so the people who want to choose to ignore him can do it. This way, their choice of destiny is really free. Okay, so that's a really good point. Let's do another one. Here's challenge number 4. You and I are pretty much atheists. You don't believe in Zeus or Thor, and I don't either. I just take it one deity further. I don't believe in your God either. So let's say there are 3,000 gods. I don't believe in all 3,000. You don't believe in 2,999. So we're pretty much the same. It said that's coming actually from Richard Dawkins' book, his God Delusion. He said, what's an atheist? Someone who doesn't believe in the existence of any God. He said, and Charlie says, I do believe God exists. I'm not an atheist in the slightest degree. And he says, I understand why you don't believe in Zeus or Thor. There's no good evidence that they ever existed. It's really hard to find anybody today who believes in either one of them. But Charlie says more than 2 billion people believe in the God of the Bible. And that includes scientists and doctors and philosophers and historians. Why would that be? Why do they reject Zeus and Thor, but they come down on the side of the God of the Bible? Charlie says, I think it's because there's good, intellectually satisfying evidence for this God. You got the fine-tuning of the universe. You got the complexity of living organisms, that information that he talked about that's in DNA. You've got something like 200 or 300 fulfilled prophecies in the Bible. The historical evidence for Jesus. More than 100 details about his life have been corroborated by historical sources that are outside the New Testament. So he said, many of us have concluded God exists. And then the challenge at the end of that section, if I shared an article, a book, or a video with you that laid out some of these evidences for God, would you be willing to read or watch it? And he's got some of those, again, on his website. He ends the section here. I'm persuaded that men think there is no God because they wish there were none. They find it hard to believe in God and to go on in sin, so they try to get an easy conscience by denying his existence. Okay, here's question number 5. Challenge number 5. The Bible condones slavery. Only evil, selfish men would concoct a book like that. Okay, so that's a good challenge. You might think about, how would you answer that? The Bible condones slavery, so therefore it's got to be an evil book. Charlie says, slavery was not part of God's original plan for humanity. It wouldn't exist at all if you didn't have people living in rebellion to God's instructions. The Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's in Leviticus 19 and Matthew 22. And we're supposed to regard one another as more important than ourselves. That's Philippians 2. How could slavery flourish if we all loved each other that way? Kidnapping humans is a sin. That carried the death penalty in the Old Testament. Exodus 21:16, Deuteronomy 24:7. And buying and selling slaves is condemned in the Bible alongside murder. That's 1 Timothy 1, 8 through 10. Well, then he says, all right, does the Bible have some verses instructing people how to treat slaves? Yes. Look at Colossians 4:1. Well, in biblical times, look at Leviticus 25:39, people could sell themselves to be servants to pay off some debts. That was really common because there were no banks back then. So for the servants' sake, God gave the Israelites instructions how to treat these servants. Now it's to protect and to help them, not harm them or keep them down. For example, Exodus 20:10 says that servants were to have every seventh day of the week off. Deuteronomy 23:16 says don't mistreat slaves. And Charlie points out it was Christians who led the fight to abolish slavery in England and America long ago, and Christians today are at the forefront of the battle to get rid of sex slave trade today. Yeah. So that's a good one. Well, let's do one more that is, again, a challenge to Christians from the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament, this is number 6, the God of the Old Testament commanded genocide. That's wiping out the Canaanite people. That's in the book of Joshua. What kind of loving God would do that? He said, well, here are some questions we could ask. Have you read the Old Testament passages regarding the Canaanites? What were they doing that brought judgment on them? What's your take on this? The Bible tells us the Canaanites were terrible people. They're involved in incest, adultery, polygamy, bestiality, witchcraft, child sacrifice to an idol named Moloch. I mean, they would throw their kids onto a hot idol and burn them to death, and other abominable customs. I even read that other people in that area in that time talked about the Canaanites being the most abusive, awful people. They were a threat to everybody around them. So God determined the Canaanites' time on his planet was up. God created the earth. He created its inhabitants. He has a right to do what he thinks is best. All life belongs to him. So think about human governments back in World War II. We tried to stop the Nazis because of what they were doing, the genocide they were doing. So if human governments have the right to send in military force to stop evildoers, doesn't God have the right? It says if you had lived at the time of Joshua, if you were aware of what was going on in Canaan, you probably would have been in favor of God getting involved in that. Unless you think burning children alive is okay. No, not at all. So I think that's a really good response to that. Well, I'll stop here, but we've done 6 of the, a total of 50 different objections. And I think, again, Charlie does an excellent job. Says get quick answers to atheists and skeptics, top 50 objections to God in the Bible. Again, alwaysbeready.com is where you can go to find out more about Charlie Campbell and his organization. I highly recommend this. This is a 3rd edition that I have. Who knows? He may have a 4th edition out by now. Let's see. Mine came out in 2018. Yeah, I bet he's got a newer edition. So, and since it's 3rd edition, you might think about picking up a used copy someplace. I know you'd get a lot out of it. Well, thanks so much for being part of our podcast. We'll do another one soon.